Hello everyone, this is Story Time with Mrs. Buckley and I'm going to read a book I've not read before, and it's by Philip Pullman, who you might have heard of, and I think he's written a book called Northern Lights, and this is called Clockwork or All Wound Up. So that's the book I'm reading today. There's a little preface first, which is like a beginning, a bit of information about the book beforehand. So I'm just going to read that to you first. In the old days, when this story took place, time used to run by clockwork. Real clockwork, I mean, springs and cogwheels and gears and pendulums and so on. When you took it apart, you could see how it worked and how to put it together again. Nowadays, time runs out. Time runs by electricity and vibrating crystals of quartz and good knows what else. You can even buy a watch that's powered by a solar panel and sets itself several times a day by picking up a radio signal and never runs a second late. Clocks and watches like that might as well work by witchcraft for all the sense I can make of them. Real clockwork is quite mysterious enough. Take a spring, for instance, like the mainspring of an alarm clock. It's made of tempered steel with an edge that's sharp enough to draw blood. If you play about with it carelessly, it'll spring up and strike at you like a snake and put out your eye. Or take a weight, the kind of iron weight that drives the mighty clocks they have in church towers. If your head were under that weight, and if the weight fell, it would dash out your brains on the floor. But with the help of a few gears and pins and a little balance wheel oscillating to and fro, or a pendulum swinging from side to side, the strength of the spring and the power of the weight are led harmlessly through the clock to drive the hands. And once you've wound up a clock, there's something frightful in the way it keeps on going at its own relentless pace. Its hands move steadily round the dial as if they had a mind of their own. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Bit by bit they move and tickle steadily on towards the grave. Some stories are like that. Once you've wound them up, nothing will stop them. They move on forwards till they reach their destined end, and no matter how much the characters would like to change their fate, they can't. This is one of those stories, and now it's all wound up. We can begin. Part 1. Once upon a time, when time ran by clockwork, a strange event took place in a little German town. Actually, it was a series of events, all fitting together like the parts of a clock, and although each person saw a different part, no one saw the whole of it. But here it is, as well as I can tell you. It began on a winter's evening when the townsfolk were gathering in the White Horse Tavern. The snow was blowing down from the mountains and the wind was making the bells shift restlessly in the church tower. The windows were steamed up, the stove was blazing brightly. Putsy, the old black cat, was snoozing on the hearth, and the air was full of the rich smells of sausage and sauerkraut, of tobacco and beer. Gretel, the little barmaid, the landlord's daughter, was hurrying to and fro with foaming mugs and steaming plates. The door opened and fat white flakes of snow swirled in, to faint away into water as they met the heat of the parlour. The incomers, Herr Ringelmann, the clockmaker, and his apprentice Karl, stamped their boots and shook the snow off their great coats. "It's Herr Ringelmann," said Burgomaster. "Well, old friend, come and drink some beer with me, and a mug for young what's-his-name, your apprentice." Karl, the apprentice, nodded his thanks and went to sit by himself in a corner. His expression was dark and gloomy. "What's the matter with young Thingamajig?" said the Burgomaster. "He looks as if he swallowed a thundercloud." "Oh, I shouldn't worry," said the old clockmaker, sitting down at the table with his friends. "He's anxious about tomorrow. His apprenticeship is coming to an end, you see." "Ah, of course," said the Burgomaster. "It was the custom that when a clockmaker's apprentice finished his period of service, he made a new figure for the great clock of Glockenheim. So we're to have a new piece of clockwork in the tower. Well, I look forward to seeing it tomorrow." "I remember when my apprenticeship came to an end," said Herr Ringelmann. "I couldn't sleep for thinking about what would happen when my figure came out of the clock. Supposing I hadn't counted the cogs properly? Supposing the spring was too stiff? Supposing... Oh, 1,000 things go through your mind. It's a heavy responsibility." Maybe so, but I've never seen the lad look so gloomy before, said someone else. And he's not a cheerful fellow at the best of times. And it seemed to the other drinkers that Herr Ringelmann himself was a little downhearted, but he raised his mug with the rest of them and changed the conversation to another topic. I hear young Fritz, the novelist, is going to read to us his new story tonight, he said. So I believe, said the burgomaster. I hope it's not as terrifying as the last one he read to us. Do you know, I woke up 3 times that night and found my hair on end just thinking about it. I don't know if it's more frightening hearing them here in the parlour or reading them later on your own, said someone else. It's worse on your own, believe me, said another. You can feel the ghostly fingers creeping up on your spine, and even when you know what's going to happen next, you can't help jumping when it does. Then they argued about whether it was more terrifying to hear a ghost story when you didn't know what was going to happen because it took you by surprise, or when you did because there was suspense waiting for it. They all enjoyed ghost stories, and Fritz's in particular, for he was a talented storyteller. The subject of their conversation, Fritz, the writer himself, was a cheerful-looking young man who had been eating his supper at the other end of the parlour. He joked with the landlord, he laughed with his neighbours, and when he finished he called for another mug of beer, gathered up the untidy pile of manuscript behind his plate, and went to talk to Carl. Hello, old boy, he said cheerfully. All set for tomorrow? I'm looking forward to it. What are you going to show us? Carl scowled and turned away. The artistic temperament, said the landlord wisely. Drink up your beer and have another on the house in the honour of tomorrow. Put poison in and I'll drink it then, muttered Carl. What? Said Fritz, who could hardly believe his ears. The two of them were sitting right at the end of the bar, and Fritz moved as to turn his back to the rest of the company and speak to Carl in private. What's the matter, old fellow? He went on quietly. You've been working at your masterpiece for months. Surely you're not worried about it. It can't fail. Carl looked at him with a face full of savage bitterness. I haven't made a figure, he muttered. I couldn't do it. I failed, Fritz. The clock will chime tomorrow and everyone will be looking up to see what I've done, and nothing will come out. Nothing. He groaned softly and turned away. I can't face them, he went on. I should go and throw myself off the tower now and have done with it. Oh, come on, don't talk like that, said Fritz, who had never seen his friend so bitter. You must have a word with old Herr Ringelmann, ask his advice. Tell him what you've hit a snag. He's a decent old fellow. He'll help you out. You don't understand, said Carl passionately. Everything's so easy for you. You just sit at your desk and put pen to paper and stories come pouring out. You don't know what it's to sweat and strain for hours on end with no ideas at all, or to struggle with materials that break tools that go blunt, or to tear your hair out trying to find a new variation in the same old theme. I tell you, Fritz, it's a wonder I haven't blown my brains out long before this. Well, it won't be long now. Tomorrow morning you can all laugh at me. Carl the failure, Carl the hopeless, Carl the first apprentice to fail in hundreds of years of clockmaking. I don't care. I shall be lying at the bottom of the river under the ice. Fritz had to stop himself interrupting when Carl spoke about the difficulty of working. Stories are just as hard as clocks to put together, and they can go wrong just as easily, as we shall see with Fritz's own story in a page or two. Still, Fritz was an optimist and Carl was a pessimist, and that makes all the difference in the world. Putsy the cat, waking from his snooze on the hearth, came and rubbed his back against Carl's legs. Carl kicked him savagely away. Steady on, said Fritz, but Carl only scowled. He drank deeply and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand before banging the mug on the counter and calling for more. Gretel, the young barmaid, looked anxiously at Fritz because she was only a child and wasn't sure whether she should be serving someone in Carl's condition. Give him some more, said Fritz. He's not drunk, poor fellow. He's unhappy. I'll keep an eye on him. Don't you worry. So Gretel poured some more beer for Carl, and the clockmaker's apprentice scowled and turned away. Fritz was worried about him, but he couldn't stay there any longer because the patrons were calling for him. Come on, Fritz, what's the story? Sing for your supper. Come on, we're all waiting. What's it about this time, eh? Skeletons or ghosts? I hope it's a nice murder. No, I hear he's got something quite different for us this time, something quite new. I've got a feeling it's going to be more horrible than anything we could imagine, said old Johann the woodcutter. While the drinkers ordered more mugs of beer to see them through the story and filled their pipes and settled themselves comfortably, Fritz gathered up his manuscript and took his place by the stove. To tell the truth, Fritz was less comfortable himself than he had ever been before at one of these storytelling evenings, because of what Carl had just told him, and because of the theme of his story. Of the start of it, anyway. But after all, it wasn't about Carl. The subject was really quite different. There was another private reason for Fritz to be nervous. The fact was he hadn't actually finished the story. He'd written the start all right, and it was terrific, but he hadn't been able to think of an ending. He was just going to wind up the story, set it going, and make the end when he got there. As I said just now, he was an optimist. "We're all ready and waiting," said the burgomaster. "I'm looking forward to this story, even if it does make my hair stand on end. What's it called?" "It's called," said Fritz, with a nervous glance at Carl. It's called Clockwork." "Ah, very appropriate," cried old Herr Ringelmann. "Did you hear that, Carl? This is a story in your honour, my boy." Carl scowled and looked down at the floor. No, said Fritz hastily. "This story isn't about Carl or the clock in our town. No, not at all. It's quite different. It just happens to be called Clockwork." "Well, set it going," said someone. "We're all ready." So Fritz cleared his throat and arranged his papers and began to read Fritz's story. I wonder if any of you remember the extraordinary business at the palace a few years ago. They tried to hush it up, but some details came out, and a bizarre mystery it was too. It seemed that Prince Otto had taken his young son Florian hunting, together with an old friend in the royal family, Baron Stelgratz. It was the dead of winter, just like now. They'd set off in a sledge for the hunting lodge up in the mountains, well wrapped up against the cold, and they weren't expected back for a week or so. Well, what should happen but that only 2 nights later the sentry on duty at the palace saw a commotion down the road and heard the whinnying of horses, whinnying in panic, making a terrible racket, and it looked as though, he couldn't be sure, as if a sledge was being driven towards the palace by a madman. The sentry raised the alarm and called for lights, and when the sledge got close enough they could see it was a royal sledge, the very one the prince had set off in only 2 nights before. It was hurtling up the road behind those terrified horses, and it wasn't going to stop. And the sergeant of the guard gave orders to drag the palace gates open quickly before it crashed. They got them open just in time. The sledge rushed through and then drove round and round the courtyard, for the horses were mad with fear and couldn't stop. The poor beasts were covered with foam and their eyes were rolling, and the sledge would be going round that courtyard still if one of the runners hadn't caught on the mounting block and turned the whole thing over. Out fell the driver and out fell a bundle from the back of the sledge. A servant hastened to pick it up and found little Prince Florian wrapped in a fur rug, safe and warm and half asleep. But as for the driver, well, as soon as the sentries came close, they saw who it was. It was none other than Prince Otto himself, stark, dead, as cold as ice, with his eyes wide and staring ahead of him, his left hand gripping the reins so tight they had to be cut loose. And this was the strangest part. His right hand still moving, lashing the whip up and down, up and down, up and down. They covered him up so the princess wouldn't see him, and took little Prince Florian to her to prove he was alive and well, because he was their only child. But what was to be done with Prince Otto? They took his body into the palace and sent for the royal physician, a worthy old man who'd studied at Heidelberg and Paris and Bologna, and who published a treatise on the location of the soul. He'd studied geology and hydrology and physiology, but he'd never seen anything like this before, a dead body that wouldn't keep still. Imagine that, stretched out icy cold on a marble slab, with its right arm lashing and lashing and lashing with no sign it was ever going to stop. The physician locked the door to keep the servants out and brought the lamp closer and bent low to look, and then his eye was caught by something in the clumsy arrangement of the clothes. So, avoiding the lashing right arm, he carefully unfastened the cloak and the fur coat and the underjacket and the shirt and laid the prince's chest bare. And there it was, a gash across his chest, just over the heart, crudely sewn up with a dozen stitches. The physician got his scissors and snipped them away. Then he nearly fainted with surprise, because when he opened the wound, there was no heart there. Instead, there was a little piece of clockwork, just a few cogs and springs and a balance wheel, attached in subtle ways to the prince's veins, and ticking away merrily in perfect time with the lashing of his arm. Well, you can imagine how the physician crossed himself and took a sip of brandy to calm his nerves. Who wouldn't? Then he carefully cut the attachments and lifted out the clockwork, and as he did so, the arm fell still. Just like that. As he got to the point of his story, Fritz paused for a sip of beer and to see how his audience was taking it. The silence in the inn was profound. Every single customer was sitting so still they might have been dead themselves, except for the wide eyes and expressions of tense excitement. He had never had such a success. He turned the page and read on. Fritz's story continued. Well, the physician sewed up Prince Otto's wound and let it be known that the prince had died of apoplexy. The servants who carried the body in thought differently. They knew a dead man when they saw one, even if his arm was moving. At any rate, the official version was that Prince Otto had suffered a contusion of the brain and that his love for his son had kept him alive just long enough to drive him safely home. He was buried with a good deal of ceremony and everyone was in mourning for 6 months. As for what happened to Baron Stelgratz, the other member of the hunting party, no one could guess. The whole affair was shrouded in mystery. But the royal physician had an idea. There was one man who might be able to explain what had happened, and that was the great Dr. Calmenius of Schatzberg, of whom very few people had heard, but those who did know him said he was the cleverest man in Europe for making clockwork. He had no equal. Now, not even good Herr Ringelmann. He could make intricate pieces of calculating apparatus that worked out the positions of all the stars and the planets and answer any mathematical questions. Dr. Calmenius could have made his fortune if he wanted to, but he wasn't interested in fortune or in fame. He was interested in something far deeper than that. He would spend hours sitting in graveyards contemplating the mysteries of life and death. Some said he experimented on dead bodies. Others said he was in a league with the powers of darkness. No one knew for certain, but one thing they did know was that he was used to walking about at night, pulling behind him a little sledge containing whatever secret matter he was working on at the time. What did he look like, this philosopher of the night? He was very tall and thin, with a prominent nose and jaw. His eyes blazoned like coals of caverns in the darkness. His hair was long and grey, and he wore a black coat with a loose hood like that of a monk. He had a harsh, grating voice and an expression full of savage curiosity. And that was the man who... Fritz stopped. He swallowed and his eyes moved to the door. Everyone followed his gaze. The parlour had never been so still. No one moved, no one dared to breathe, for the latch was lifting. The door slowly opened. And I'll read the next bit next time. Nice to see you all. Hope you'll listen again. Bye.